the greatest mystery in the world, is life itself. Where did it come from? Why do hummingbirds exist alongside whales? Why do human embryos have gill slits? Why are there blind fish in dark caves? For thousands of years, the answer was simple. God made it so. Then in 1859, a British naturalist published a book that answered the mystery differently, and the world has been arguing about it ever since. Tonight we explore the life of Charles Darwin, the man who solved the riddle of life. He was an unlikely revolutionary, no mathematical genius, no radical firebrand, just a curious observer with a beetle collection. He bred pigeons, he studied barnacles for 8 years, he watched earthworms, and from these small observations he built a theory that would change everything. We'll journey with him to the Galapagos Islands, where finches held the secret. We'll see the evidence he gathered from fossils, from breeding, from the structure of life itself. We'll witness his 20-year silence, the fear that stopped him from publishing, and the moment another scientist nearly stole his discovery. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach, and it helps connect us as a community of curious minds. So prepare to follow the greatest detective story in science, a man who looked at the natural world and saw not the hand of God, but the slow, patient, beautiful work of time and change. This is the story of Charles Darwin. Chapter 1. The Death Collector, February 1817. An 8-year-old boy sits in his mother's bedroom in Shrewsbury, England, watching her die. Not quickly, which might have been a mercy, but slowly, over months, in a way that gives him too much time to notice every detail of how a body fails. The room smells like sickness, that particular sweetness of flesh beginning to turn, and the doctors call it abdominal illness because they don't know what's wrong and can't fix it. So they give it a name that means nothing and collect their fees and leave. Charles watches his mother's body betray her in ways that will haunt him for the rest of his life. She can't eat without vomiting. Her skin turns the colour of old parchment left too long in sunlight. Her eyes sink deeper into her face each day, retreating from the world, and he sits there beside her bed, trying to understand what's happening, what this process is, how a living thing becomes a dead thing. They send him away before she dies in July, because 8 years old is too young to watch your mother stop breathing, too young to see the exact moment when life leaves a body. But the image has already burned itself into him. He's seen enough to know that something profound happens in that transition, something he doesn't have words for yet, something about the boundary between life and death that will obsess him for decades to come. After she's buried in the churchyard at St. Chad's, Charles becomes strange in ways that disturb his older sisters, Caroline, Susan, and Emily, while other boys his age are collecting stamps or coins, trading them with friends in the schoolyard, organising them in neat little albums with careful labels. Charles collects dead things, beetles with their legs curled up against their bodies, moths with their wings spread and pinned through their thoraxes, birds he finds in the garden with their necks broken, their eyes glazed over, their feathers already losing their colour. He brings them to his room in the big house at the Mount, sets them on boards he's made himself, labels them with names he doesn't fully understand yet, names in Latin he's copied from books. He studies how they decay, how the colours fade from bright to dull, how the flesh withers away from bone, how the structures that once held life collapse back into their constituent parts. His sisters find this disturbing and say so at dinner. His father, Robert Darwin, a physician who weighs over 300 pounds and fills doorways when he enters rooms, finds it annoying and says so loudly. You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat catching, Robert tells him one evening, standing in the doorway of Charles's room, looking at the dead things spread across every surface. And you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. But there's a method here, even if Charles can't articulate it yet, even if it looks like morbid obsession to everyone watching. He's trying to understand what his mother became. He dissects a bird one afternoon, when everyone else is out, carefully opening its body with a knife he's borrowed from the kitchen, and inside he finds organs and blood and structure. This intricate machinery that once made it fly. Outside there are feathers and colour and the shape of flight itself, and somewhere in his child's mind he's asking a question that won't find its answer for another 40 years. How does one become the other? How does life organise itself? How does complexity arise from these simple parts? He doesn't have words for these questions yet, and doesn't have the framework to even properly ask them. He just knows he needs to watch things die so he can understand how they lived. His older brother Erasmus, called Ras by everyone in the family, is everything Charles isn't, and this fact shapes every interaction between them. Ras is brilliant at chemistry, focused in his studies, mature beyond his years. Their father adores Ras, lights up when he enters a room, asks about his experiments, his readings, his plans. Robert Darwin tolerates Charles the way you tolerate a persistent dog that won't stop following you around. In 1822, when Charles is 13 and still collecting his dead things, Robert sends both boys to Edinburgh University to study medicine, because that's what Darwin men do. They become physicians. Ras is 18 and ready. Charles is 16 and completely unprepared. The contradiction cuts deep into Charles, even at this young age. He hero worships his brother, follows him around when Ras allows it, wants desperately to be like him, to earn the same approval from their father. But he knows he can never be Ras, can never match that natural brilliance, that easy confidence, and this creates a pattern that will define the rest of his life. A pattern he won't recognise until it's played out dozens of times. He'll seek mentors, older men who represent what he's not, who embody the qualities he thinks he lacks. He'll learn from them, absorb everything they can teach him, and then eventually he'll surpass them and cast them aside. First, victim. Ras, though the betrayal will be subtle. Second, Captain Fitzroy, though that one will be devastating. Third, his own father, though Robert won't live to see it. Fourth, God himself, though that betrayal will be the most complete. Edinburgh in 1825 is a grey city of stone buildings and constant rain, and Charles is 17 years old when he attends his first surgery at the medical school. You need to understand what surgery meant in 1825, before anaesthesia existed, before anyone understood that pain could be eliminated rather than simply endured. A child lies on the operating table, and the child is screaming because surgeons are cutting into living flesh, while the patient is fully conscious, fully aware, and the only options are speed or spirits, and neither one really helps. The surgeons work as fast as they can, while assistants hold the child down, and the screaming fills the operating theatre, echoes off the stone walls, and Charles runs out before the procedure is finished. He vomits in the corridor outside, retches until there's nothing left, and then he leans against the cold stone wall and understands something fundamental about himself. He will never return to another surgery. He physically cannot. His father wants him to become a doctor, like all the Darwin men, wants him to take over the practice eventually, and Charles knows in this moment that he will fail at this too, that he's failing his father again. But this failure is formative in ways he can't see yet. He can watch death but not suffering, Not, he can dissect a bird that's already dead, but he cannot cut into living flesh. He needs distance, observation, not intervention. This will define his science decades later, when he's famous and people are studying his methods. He's not an experimenter like Pasteur, who actively intervenes in nature. He's not a mathematician like Newton, who sits in rooms alone and works out the laws of the universe in his head. He's a watcher, a collector of dead things that tell stories about life. At Edinburgh, he joins the Plinian Society, a group of undergraduates who meet in a basement room on Tuesday evenings to discuss radical natural history, the kind of ideas that get you in trouble if you say them too loudly in public. Here he meets Robert Grant, a 32-year-old zoologist with intense eyes and strong opinions, who introduces him to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's ideas about species transformation. Grant believes that species change over time, that one species can become another through some process nobody understands yet. This is heresy in 1826, because the Bible is clear that God created all species fixed and unchanging, that the lions and lambs of Eden are the same lions and lambs that walk the earth now. Charles presents a paper to the Plinian Society on observations of sea creatures near the Firth of Forth, describing in careful detail how certain organisms reproduce, how their larvae develop. The findings are minor, barely worth noting in the grand scheme of things, but he's learning to see patterns, to think about how organisms adapt to their environments, to ask questions about the relationship between structure and function. The seeds are being planted, though he doesn't know it yet, though it will be another decade before these questions bloom into something larger. His father pulls him from Edinburgh in 1827, because medical school is pointless if Charles won't practice medicine, and Robert is tired of paying for an education his son is wasting. New plan: Cambridge, to study theology and become a country parson. It's a safe profession, respectable, comfortable, a backup plan for failures, and everyone in the family knows it, though nobody says it directly. Charles agrees because he has no alternative, no other path forward. He's 18 years old. He's failed at the one career his father chose for him. His mother is dead 7 years now. His brother outshines him in every possible way. He collects beetles and shoots birds and has no idea what he's supposed to do with his life. The pattern is established now, though Charles doesn't recognise it as a pattern yet. Charles Darwin learns through failure. Edinburgh taught him he can't heal living things, can't bear to watch them suffer. Cambridge will teach him he can't believe in God, at least not the way everyone expects him to, and the Beagle, when it comes, will teach him why. Chapter 2. The Beetle Maniac. Charles arrives at Cambridge in the autumn of 1828 to study theology, and the plan is simple enough that even his father thinks it might work. Become a country clergyman. Find a comfortable parish somewhere in the English countryside. Small congregation, modest salary, plenty of time left over for collecting beetles. It's what happens to gentlemen who aren't quite good enough for anything else. And everyone understands this without saying it out loud. Robert Darwin is spending £200 a year on this education, watching his younger son waste it on insects. But here's what nobody sees yet, what won't become clear for another 30 years. The obsession isn't waste, it's training. Every beetle Charles catches and pins to a board, every specimen he catalogues with its Latin name carefully written in his notebook, every afternoon spent stripping bark from dead trees, looking for rare species, he's learning classification. How to see differences that matter, how to notice which features separate one species from another and which are just individual variations. This is pre-theory Darwin, the method developing before he has any idea what he'll use it for. Picture a spring morning in 1829. Charles is stripping bark from an old tree a few miles outside Cambridge, and he finds two rare beetles, both species he's been hunting for months. He grabs one in each hand, feels them moving against his palms, and then he sees a third beetle, even rarer than the other two, crawling out from under the same piece of bark. No free hands. The decision takes maybe half a second. He shoves one of the beetles into his mouth to free up a hand for the third. The beetle secretes defensive acid, burns his tongue immediately, this sharp chemical pain that makes his eyes water. He spits it out, loses all three beetles in the confusion, ends up on the ground with his tongue swelling up, and two rare beetles scattered into the grass, gone forever. His cousin, William Darwin Fox, finds him a few minutes later, lying in the dirt, tongue hanging out of his mouth, like a dog on a hot day. "What in God's name are you doing, Charles?" Tongue too swollen to speak properly. "There were three." Fox doesn't understand that this isn't stupidity. This is the same compulsion that will make Darwin spend 8 years studying nothing but barnacles. The same focus that will make him dissect his own children's facial expressions to understand emotional evolution. When Darwin's attention locks onto something, everything else disappears. The world narrows to just the question and whatever might answer it. In his 3 years at Cambridge, Charles catalogues over 2,000 beetle specimens. He's not discovering new species yet, not talented enough for that, doesn't have the eye that comes from decades of experience, but he's building the database, training his brain to see patterns in variation. Years later, when he's on the Galapagos Islands looking at finch beaks, he'll know instinctively which differences matter and which don't. And that knowledge will come from these 3 years of obsessive beetle collecting that everyone thinks is a waste of time. Compare this to how most gentlemen naturalists collect, casually. A nice butterfly here, an interesting beetle there, pressed into albums and mostly forgotten. Darwin collects systematically, records the exact date and location of every find, notes the weather conditions, describes the habitat, logs which other species were present. He's 19 years old and building a methodology that doesn't exist yet, preparing for a question he hasn't learned to ask. In 1829, Charles meets John Stevens Henslow, a botany professor, 13 years older than him, and something clicks into place that's been missing since his mother died. Henslow is everything Robert Darwin isn't: patient, encouraging, genuinely interested in Charles's weird obsessions with dead insects. They start taking daily walks around Cambridge, these long rambling conversations about plants and geology and the distribution of species across landscapes. Other students notice, start calling Charles the man who walks with Henslow, and it's meant as mockery, but Charles doesn't care. He's found something he needed without knowing he needed it. Henslow asks questions that Charles has never thought to ask. Why does this plant species grow on this side of the valley, but not that side, when the soil seems identical? Why do similar environments sometimes have completely different species living in them? Why do islands far from continents have such strange, unique creatures? These questions will haunt Darwin for decades, worm their way into his thinking until they become the central problems of his life's work. The pattern continues, this thing Darwin does without realizing it's a pattern. He needs external validation because his father provides none. Henslow gives it freely, tells Charles he's clever, that his observations are sharp, that he should pursue natural history seriously. And this makes Henslow powerful in Charles's life, makes him matter in ways that will eventually make him disposable. Like all Darwin's mentors, you can't surpass someone who doesn't matter. You can only betray people you once needed. Cambridge requires all students to study William Paley's natural theology, and Charles finds the arguments beautiful, convincing in ways that feel almost mathematical. Paley's logic is simple. Design implies a designer. A watch requires a watchmaker. The human eye is infinitely more complex than any watch, therefore God designed it. Everything in nature is perfectly adapted to its purpose. The shape of a bird's wing for flight, the structure of a fish's gills for breathing water, the camouflage of insects against tree bark. All of this points to divine craftsmanship. Charles believed this completely in 1831. Absorb it, take detailed notes, writes essays defending it. The irony is almost painful if you know what's coming. He's learning the arguments he'll spend the rest of his life systematically destroying. He's memorizing the enemy's position from the inside, though he doesn't know it's the enemy yet. He still thinks God designed beetles, designed their defensive acid secretions, designed everything down to the smallest detail. Summer of 1831. Charles returns to Shrewsbury from a geology trip to Wales, covered in rock dust and sunburned, carrying samples he's collected from the mountains. There's a letter waiting for him from Henslow. Would Charles be interested in joining HMS Beagle as a gentleman naturalist? 2-year voyage around the world. Unpaid position, but all expenses covered. Captain Robert Fitzroy needs someone educated to collect specimens and provide civilized conversation. Henslow had recommended Charles. Charles's first reaction, immediate and visceral. Yes, absolutely yes. Everything he's been doing for the last decade, collecting, cataloguing, asking questions about distribution and adaptation, it's all been preparing him for exactly this kind of opportunity. A chance to see the world, to collect specimens from places no English naturalist has ever visited, to make observations that might actually matter. His father's reaction? Absolutely not. Robert Darwin is tired of Charles's nonsense. The boy is 22 years old. He needs to settle down, accept a parish position, marry his cousin Emma Wedgwood. Yes, his first cousin, because the Darwin and Wedgwood families have been intermarrying for generations, and nobody thinks this is strange. Voyaging around the world, collecting dead things is not a career. It's another escape, another way for Charles to avoid growing up and accepting responsibility. Charles writes to Fitzroy that same day, polite and apologetic. I cannot accept your generous offer. My father disapproves. He's ready to abandon the voyage completely, to accept his father's judgment like he's accepted it his entire life. But Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, intervenes. Josiah is Robert's brother-in-law, one of the few people whose opinion Robert actually respects. Josiah tells Robert directly, "Let the boy go. The voyage will mature him. Give him purpose and direction. Make him into someone respectable, instead of just another country parson collecting beetles in his spare time until he dies forgotten." Robert agrees, not because he believes Josiah is right, because he's exhausted from arguing about Charles, tired of fighting this losing battle with a son who keeps failing at everything he's told to do. Fine, let him go sail around the world. Maybe he'll finally grow up. Maybe the whole thing will be a disaster and Charles will come home ready to accept reality. Either way, Robert is done arguing. Chapter 3. The Devil's Chaplain. The Beagle leaves Plymouth on the morning after Christmas in 1831, and Charles Darwin vomits before they clear the harbour. The ship is 90 feet long, barely bigger than a modern yacht, and 74 people are crammed aboard with supplies for what's advertised as a 2-year voyage. It will actually be 5 years. Charles shares a cabin with Captain Robert Fitzroy 10 feet by 11 feet, smaller than most bathrooms. And if they end up hating each other, there's nowhere to go. You can't escape someone when you're trapped in a wooden box floating on the ocean. Fitzroy is 26 years old, 4 years older than Charles, and he's everything Charles isn't. Aristocratic bloodline, brilliant navigator, intense and focused in ways that border on frightening, and deeply, rigidly Christian in the way that only certain Englishmen of the 1830s could be. Where the Bible is literal truth, and questioning it is not just wrong, but dangerous. Fitzroy has brought Darwin along specifically because he needs someone educated who can find geological evidence proving Noah's flood happened exactly as Genesis describes. That's the mission Fitzroy thinks they're on. Find proof of the flood, document it scientifically, silence the skeptics who keep questioning biblical chronology. Darwin doesn't know yet that he's been hired to prove something he'll eventually disprove. The seasickness is immediate and devastating. Charles can't stand without vomiting, can't eat, can't sleep in his hammock without the swaying motion triggering another bout of nausea. He loses weight rapidly, becomes hollow-cheeked and weak. The cabin reeks of vomit and preserved specimens. He's already collecting, even though he can barely move. And Fitzroy, who never gets seasick, finds this weakness contemptible. A gentleman should be able to control his own body. But here's the thing about Darwin's seasickness that changes everything. It forces him to spend time on shore whenever the Beagle anchors. Those shore expeditions, weeks and months hiking through South American jungles and mountains while the ship surveys coastlines. That's where he makes every important observation of the voyage. If he'd been comfortable at sea, he would have stayed aboard, would have missed everything that matters. His weakness becomes his advantage. His body's betrayal becomes the reason he succeeds. The Beagle's first stop after crossing the Atlantic is the Cape Verde Islands in January of 1832, and Charles goes ashore at Santiago, grateful for solid ground under his feet. He's walking along a cliff face when he notices something that doesn't fit Fitzroy's flood geology. A horizontal band of white shells and coral perfectly preserved running along the cliff about 45 feet above sea level. These are marine creatures. They lived underwater. Now they're 45 feet up. Two possible explanations. Fitzroy's, the great flood deposited them there when the waters rose to cover the earth, then receded. Darwin's developing alternative. The land rose, slowly, over time. The sea level stayed constant, but the ground lifted those shells 45 feet into the air. If land can rise 45 feet, what else can change? The question plants itself in Darwin's mind, like a seed that will take years to germinate. Fitzroy had given Darwin a parting gift before they sailed, Volume 1 of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Ironic gift because Lyell's book systematically contradicts everything Fitzroy believes about Earth's history. Lyell argues the Earth is millions of years old, not 6,000. That geological features form through slow, gradual processes, erosion, deposition, uplift, repeated over inconceivable spans of time. Mountains rise grain by grain. Valleys are carved by rivers over millennia. The earth is ancient beyond human comprehension. Darwin reads Lyell in his vomit-soaked cabin, while the Beagle sails south toward Brazil, and something expands in his thinking. If the earth can change slowly over millions of years, why couldn't species? The connection isn't explicit yet. He's not making that leap consciously, but the pieces are assembling in his mind whether he realises it or not. Fitzroy is accidentally giving Darwin the tools to destroy everything Fitzroy believes. When the Beagle anchored in Bahia, Brazil in April of 1832, Darwin goes ashore and see slavery for the first time. Not abstract slavery from history books, but actual humans in chains, beaten when they work too slowly, sold in markets like livestock, and the plantation owners defend it using the Bible. Cite Genesis chapter 9, where Noah curses Canaan to be a servant. Therefore slavery is divine order, God's will made manifest. Darwin argues with Fitzroy about this back on the ship, in their tiny shared cabin, where every word echoes. Fitzroy defends slavery, not because he personally owns slaves, he doesn't, but because the Bible sanctions it. And if the Bible sanctions something, who are we to question God's wisdom? Darwin pushes back. If God designed everything perfectly, if every creature is exactly as God intended, why would he design some humans specifically to be enslaved? What kind of designer creates a hierarchy where suffering is built into the structure? The argument gets heated enough that Fitzroy orders Darwin to find other accommodations, which on a 90-foot ship means there are no other accommodations. They reconcile a few days later, both apologising, both agreeing to avoid certain topics. But the crack is visible now. Fitzroy believes in divine hierarchy, fixed order, the great chain of being with God at the top and everything else in its proper place. Darwin is beginning to see hierarchy as contingent, environmental, maybe not designed at all. By December of 1832, the Beagle had reached Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America, where the land breaks apart into islands and channels, and the weather is cold even in summer. Fitzroy has 3 native Fuegians aboard, Jemmy Button, York Minster, and Fuegia Basket, names Fitzroy gave them because he couldn't pronounce their real names. He'd brought them to England on a previous voyage, civilised them, taught them English and Christianity, and how to dress properly. Now he's returning them as missionaries, proof that savages can be elevated to Christian civilization. When they arrive, Darwin meets the Fuegian natives who come to shore. They're naked despite the cold, painted with white and red pigments, speaking a language that sounds like no language he's heard before, all clicks and guttural sounds. Fitzroy's 3 civilized Fuegians look at their former tribesmen with visible disgust, don't want to be associated with them, keep their English clothes on like armour. Within months, Jemmy Button abandons everything, takes off the English clothes, washes off the civilization, returns to his tribe as if the last 3 years in England never happened. Fitzroy is devastated. His proof that savages could be permanently elevated has collapsed. The experiment failed completely. Darwin sees something different, something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Civilization is skin deep. Put a civilized man back in the wilderness, and he reverts to what he was. We're not separate from animals. We're adaptable, changeable. Our behaviour isn't fixed by divine design. It responds to the environment. This observation is dangerous. Darwin doesn't fully understand why yet. By 1833, Charles and Fitzroy were arguing constantly. Fitzroy thinks Darwin is too theoretical, too willing to speculate beyond what the evidence strictly proves. Darwin thinks Fitzroy is willfully blind, refusing to see what the evidence is screaming. They're living in a space the size of a closet, floating on the ocean thousands of miles from home, collecting evidence that means opposite things to each of them. Fitzroy suffers from what he calls his dark moods, episodes where he can't leave his cabin, can't speak to anyone, just lies in his hammock, staring at nothing. In 1865, 30 years after the Beagle voyage, he slit his own throat with a razor. The depression that's already visible in 1833 will eventually kill him. Darwin is chronically ill vomiting constantly, losing weight, but his mind is sharper than it's ever been. He's collecting thousands of specimens, rocks, fossils, bird skins, pickled lizards, pressed plants. He doesn't know what he's looking for yet. That will become clear in September of 1835, when the Beagle reaches a cluster of volcanic islands 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, the Galapagos. Darwin will spend 5 weeks there. Those 5 weeks will haunt him for the next 20 years. Chapter 4. The Galapagos Mistake. Charles Darwin steps onto the black volcanic rock of Chatham Island on a September morning in 1835, and his first reaction is disappointment. The temperature is somewhere around 95 degrees. The island looks like hell. No trees, no grass, just lava fields stretching to the horizon, and cacti that look half dead even when they're alive. Marine iguanas everywhere, piled on top of each other like living bricks, barely moving in the heat. Birds are so tame you can walk right up and touch them before they bother flying away. Tortoises the size of kitchen tables, ancient-looking things with shells like armour. Darwin writes in his journal that night, nothing could be less inviting. He's been expecting paradise, something beautiful, after 4 years of jungles and mountains and endless coastlines. Instead, he's gotten this barren wasteland where nothing should be able to live, but somehow everything does. He has no idea he's standing on the most important location in the history of biology. The first thing he notices, really notices, not just sees but recognises as strange, are the mockingbirds on Chatham. He collects several specimens, pins them, labels them with the island name. Then the Beagle moves to Charles Island, now called Floriana, and there are different mockingbirds there, similar to the Chatham birds but not identical, slightly different beak shapes, different colouring in the plumage. He notes this in his collection. On James Island, which they visit next, there's another variety. He writes in his notebook, "When I see these islands in sight of each other, I never dreamed that islands 50 or 60 miles apart would have been differently tenanted. This is the observation that should have unlocked everything." But he doesn't make the leap. He thinks God created slightly different species for each island, variation within the divine plan, the same way God created different species for England versus France. He doesn't think maybe they all came from the same ancestor and changed in isolation. Not yet. And here's the famous part, the part that gets left out of textbooks and popular science books because it's embarrassing. Darwin barely notices the finches. He collects them, sure, but sloppily. Doesn't carefully label which island each specimen came from. Mixes them together in his collection. He thinks some are finches, some are wrens, some are blackbirds. Completely different bird families. He doesn't realise they're all finches that evolved different beaks for different food sources. The famous Darwin's finches story, where Darwin sees different beak shapes and instantly understands evolution through natural selection. Complete myth. He didn't see it, didn't understand what he was looking at. It takes John Gould, an ornithologist back in London, to tell Darwin in 1837 that these are all finches, closely related species, modified for eating seeds versus insects versus cactus flowers. Darwin has to go back to his beagle crewmates and beg for their specimens because he mislabeled his own. Embarrassing, but this is crucial to understanding how Darwin actually worked. His genius wasn't instant insight. It was obsessive correction of his mistakes. He saw something, misunderstood it, then spent 20 years figuring out what he'd actually seen. The vice-governor of the Galapagos, a man named Nicholas Lawson, tells Darwin something that should have been a revelation. "I can tell which island a tortoise comes from just by looking at its shell. Chatham tortoises have differently shaped shells than James tortoises. Each island's tortoises are distinct. Darwin writes this down in his notebook, but doesn't grasp the implication. If God created tortoises, why would he create slightly different versions on islands 50 miles apart? That seems inefficient, unnecessarily complicated. A good designer would create one perfect tortoise design and use it everywhere. The answer that God didn't create them separately, that they all descended from a common ancestor and changed in isolation, is right there in front of him. He doesn't see it. He's still a creationist, barely, but still. The Beagle spends 5 weeks in the Galapagos total. Darwin goes ashore on 4 islands, Chatham, Charles, Albemarle, now called Isabella, and James. 5 weeks, not enough time. Not even close to enough time. He collects 193 plant species, 26 land birds, 11 waders, and waterfowl, reptiles, fish, insects. He eats tortoise meat and writes in his journal that it tastes good, like chicken but richer. He rides on the back of a giant tortoise one afternoon because he's 26 years old and it seems like fun. He's treating this stop like any other. Collect, label, move on to the next location. Quantify the mistake. If he'd spent 6 months in the Galapagos instead of 5 weeks, if he'd meticulously labelled every single specimen's island of origin, if he'd interviewed Lawson more carefully about the tortoises and asked follow-up questions about why each island had distinct varieties, he could have cracked evolution right there, on the spot. Could have published in 1836 when he got back to England, could have beaten everyone by 20 years. Instead, he needs 2 more decades. The Beagle leaves the Galapagos in late October of 1835, and Darwin is relieved. The islands were hot, barren, disappointing after all the build-up. He's looking forward to Tahiti, which is the next major stop because he's heard there are beautiful beaches, and the women are friendly. He has no idea he's leaving behind the key to everything. In his journal, he barely mentions the finches, writes more about the marine iguanas, which he finds disgusting, calls them hideous-looking and most disgusting clumsy lizards. The birds that will eventually make him famous get maybe 3 sentences. The pattern is established here, something fundamental about how Darwin's mind works. His breakthroughs don't come from observation, they come from retrospection. Looking backward at what he missed, realising what he didn't understand at the time, spending years piecing together what should have been obvious. He's not a genius at the moment, he's a genius in the aftermath, when everyone else has moved on, and he's still obsessing over why the tortoises have different shells. Chapter 5. The Returner. The Beagle finally returned to England on an October morning in 1836, dropping anchor at Falmouth after 5 years at sea. Charles Darwin steps onto English soil, and he's 27 years old, bearded, thin, chronically ill but alive. A lot of sailors who left on the Beagle didn't make it back. Disease, accidents. The ocean is brutal and patient, and it takes people when it wants them. Charles takes a coach to Shrewsbury, 52 hours of being jostled on bad roads, and arrives at his father's house unannounced because there was no way to send word ahead. Robert Darwin opens the door and stares at his son for a long moment before saying, "Why, the shape of his head is quite altered. Nobody's sure if that's a compliment or just an observation." Robert has a way of making statements that could mean anything, that leave you uncertain whether he's pleased or disappointed. His sisters cry when they see him. His father seems proud or at least relieved that Charles didn't die. Within a few days, Robert is asking the question he always asks, "What now? You've finished collecting your beetles and rocks. Time to find a profession. Get serious about life." Charles has no answer. He has 22 crates of specimens, dead birds, pickled lizards, rocks wrapped in paper, plant samples pressed between pages. He has notebooks filled with observations about coral reefs and earthquake damage and the distribution of species across South America. And he has no idea what any of it means yet, but something unexpected has happened while he was gone. Charles Henslow, his old botany professor at Cambridge, published excerpts from Darwin's letters in the Cambridge Philosophical Society journals. The geology observations especially, the stuff about coral reefs and how mountains were rising along the South American coast, impressed senior scientists. At 27, Darwin is being invited to present papers to the Geological Society of London. He's famous. Not widely famous, not publicly famous, but famous within the small world of English naturalists, which is the only world that matters for his career. Darwin moved to London in March of 1837, renting rooms at 36 Great Marlborough Street. His plan is straightforward. Spend the next few years writing up the Beagle voyage. 3 books, geology, zoology, and a journal of the voyage itself. Establish himself as a serious naturalist, build a reputation, maybe figure out what to do with the rest of his life. But privately, in his cramped London rooms, he's starting to think thoughts that could end his career before it begins. John Gould examines Darwin's Galapagos birds in March of 1837, and the verdict is delivered casually, almost as an aside. The mockingbirds are 3 separate species. The finches, Darwin's mixed up, poorly labelled finches, are 13 species, all closely related, all modified for different food sources, different beaks for cracking seeds versus catching insects versus probing cactus flowers. Gould's implication is clear if you're willing to see it. These birds share a common ancestor. They arrived on the Galapagos from mainland South America, then diverged on different islands, changed, adapted to local conditions, became a new species. Darwin feels something shift inside his chest when he hears this, like a floor dropping away beneath his feet. If Gould is right, species aren't fixed, they change. And if they change on the Galapagos, they change everywhere. The entire structure of creation, fixed species, divine design, the great chain of being, it all collapses. He opened a private notebook in July of 1837, labels it Notebook B. First page, he writes one word, Zoonomia. That was the title of his grandfather Erasmus Darwin's book about evolution, published in 1794 and condemned as atheistic, materialist, and dangerous. Erasmus died before Charles was born, but his reputation lingered in the family like a ghost. Charles's father had warned him repeatedly, never mention Erasmus's ideas in public. They destroyed his grandfather's reputation. Now Charles is about to resurrect those ideas with evidence. He filled notebook after notebook between July of 1837 and October of 1838. Private speculation he doesn't show anyone. Not Henslow, not Lyell, not Fitzroy. These are his secret thoughts, the ones that could ruin him if they became public. Sample entries. If we grant similarity of parent to offspring, then one species can change into another. Simple logic, but revolutionary implications. Animals whom we have made our slaves, we do not like to consider our equals. He's thinking about slavery, about Fitzroy's arguments, about why people need to believe humans are separate from animals. He who understands baboon would do more toward metaphysics than Locke. This is the crucial one. Darwin is saying consciousness isn't special. It evolved. Humans aren't separate from animals. We're modified apes. Our minds are just complex versions of baboon minds. This is heresy. He knows it. By 1838, Darwin privately believed in evolution. He believed species aren't fixed, that they change over time, that all life shares common ancestors. But he can't say this publicly. The reasons stack up like a wall between him and publication. Professional suicide. If he publishes without ironclad evidence, he'll be dismissed as another speculator like Lamarck or his grandfather. His career will be over before he's 30. Religious persecution. Evolution implies no creator. Atheism is effectively illegal in England. You can't hold public office, can't testify in court, can't attend university if you openly deny God's existence. Social isolation. His friends, Henslow, Sedgwick, Fitzroy, are all devout Christians. They'll see evolution as betrayal, as choosing science over faith, personal uncertainty. He's not completely sure he's right. What if he publishes and gets destroyed, and it turns out God does exist after all? What if his theory is wrong, and he's ruined his reputation for nothing? So he decides, gather evidence, build an unassailable case, work in private, tell no one. When the evidence is overwhelming, when even his critics can't deny it, then he'll publish. He proposed to his cousin Emma Wedgwood in November of 1838. She's 30 years old. He's 29. They've known each other since childhood. Their families have been close for generations. She's intelligent, patient, and deeply religious. Darwin makes a list before proposing. Pros and cons of marriage. Pros: constant companion, someone to take care of the household, better than a dog. Cons: less time for work, might not like London, expensive. He concludes, marry. It's not romantic, but it's practical. He needs stability. She provides it. They married on January 29th, 1839. Moved to a house in London. Emma is pregnant within months. Their first child, William, is born in December of 1839. Darwin is 30 years old. He has a wife, a home, and a growing reputation as a geologist, and a secret theory he can't tell anyone, not even his devoutly religious wife. Emma knows Charles isn't conventionally religious. He doesn't attend church regularly, makes excuses about being too ill. But she doesn't know he's become a materialist, doesn't know he's systematically dismantling every religious belief they were both raised with. She writes him letters. He saves them all, begging him not to lose faith. She's terrified they won't be reunited in heaven if he becomes an unbeliever. Charles doesn't argue with her, doesn't try to convince her he's right. Just continues filling his secret notebooks. Marriage becomes a kind of intellectual isolation. He can't share his deepest thoughts with the person closest to him, can't talk about what he's really working on, what he's really thinking about when he stares out the window for hours. This pattern, hiding revolutionary ideas from the people who love you, will define the next 20 years of his life. His wife doesn't know. His children won't know. Even his closest scientific friends only suspect. He's building a bomb in the basement while hosting dinner parties upstairs. The pressure will eventually destroy his health. But first he needs to solve one problem. How do species actually change? He has the fact of evolution. He doesn't yet have the mechanism. Chapter 6. The Mechanism. Darwin read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population on September 28, 1838, supposedly for amusement, which is the kind of thing only Victorian gentlemen say about reading dense economics treatises. Malthus's argument is brutal in its simplicity. Populations grow exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, doubling every generation. But food production grows arithmetically, 1 2, 3, 4, 5, just adding a little more each year. Therefore, populations always outstrip resources. The result is competition, starvation, and death. Most individuals die before reproducing. Darwin sees it immediately. This flash of understanding that connects everything he's been thinking about for the last year. Apply Malthus's logic to nature. Every species produces more offspring than can possibly survive. A single pair of elephants, the slowest breeders on Earth, would produce 15 million descendants in 500 years if every offspring survived and reproduced. They don't. Most die. The question is why. The answer: some individuals have slight advantages, better camouflage that makes them harder for predators to see, stronger beaks that let them crack seeds. Other birds can't open, faster legs that let them escape danger. Those individuals survive more often, reproduce more often. Over time, the population changes to resemble the survivors. This is natural selection, the mechanism of evolution. Darwin writes in his notebook, "Here then I had at last got a theory by which to work." But look at the irony. Malthus was arguing against helping the poor. He said poverty is nature's way of controlling population, and government aid just allows the unfit to survive and reproduce. Darwin takes this brutal right-wing economic theory and finds in it the engine of all biological diversity. He's turned an argument against social welfare into an explanation for why finches have different beaks. Having the mechanism is one thing, proving it's another. Darwin joins 2 London pigeon breeding clubs in 1855, builds a pigeon house at Down House. They've moved out of London by then. More on that in a moment. He breeds pigeons obsessively. Fantails with 30 tail feathers, pouters with inflated crops, runts that are tiny, carriers with huge beaks, tumblers that flip in mid-air. Why pigeons? Because breeders have created wildly different varieties from a single ancestor, the rock dove, in just centuries. If humans can create fantails with 30 tail feathers from ancestors with 12 in just 300 years, what can nature do in 3 million? He doesn't just breed them, he dissects baby pigeons to see how their skeletons develop, counts their vertebrae at different stages, measures their beaks as they grow, compares the skulls of adult fantails to adult carriers. Emma is disgusted. There are dead baby pigeons in jars all over his study, but he's building proof. Variation is real, selection is real, modification over time is real. Quantify it. Darwin breeds and dissects hundreds of pigeons over 8 years. He joins societies with working-class pigeon fanciers, men who would never normally interact with a gentleman scientist. These are people who've spent their lives perfecting specific traits, who know more about pigeon genetics through practical experience than any academic. Darwin sits in their smoky meeting rooms, takes notes on their breeding techniques, and learns how to see tiny differences that matter. But then there's the barnacle detour, 1846 to 1854. 8 years of his life were spent studying barnacles, not just one species, every species, worldwide. He dissects over 10,000 specimens, publishes 4 massive monographs that establish him as the world's leading expert on barnacle taxonomy. Why would someone who's trying to solve evolution spend 8 years on barnacles? Partly because he found an unusual barnacle species in Chile and wanted to understand it, but couldn't let the question go. But really, he's procrastinating. He knows his evolution theory is radioactive. If he publishes it, his life ends. Professional destruction, religious persecution, social isolation. So he becomes a barnacle expert instead. His children grow up thinking every gentleman scientist studies barnacles. One of his sons asks a friend, Where does your father do his barnacles? The friend has no idea what he's talking about, but the work isn't wasted. Barnacles show him that species boundaries are fuzzy, not sharp. What looks like one species on the English coast is slightly different on the Spanish coast, slightly more different on the South American coast. There's no clear dividing line where one species ends and another begins. Species blend into each other along gradients. This supports evolution. Species are just varieties that have diverged enough to become reproductively isolated. The Darwins moved to Down House in September of 1842, a village about 16 miles from London. Charles's health is collapsing, constant vomiting, trembling hands, weakness so profound he can barely work 3 hours a day. London's social obligations are exhausting him. Dinner parties, scientific meetings, the expectation that he'll show up and be charming. He can't do it anymore. Down House becomes his fortress. He builds a sand walk, a path circling his property, where he can walk and think without being disturbed. Place a pile of stones at the start. Each lap he kicks one stone off the path. 3 stones means it's a light thinking day. 5 stones means he's working on a deep problem. Some days he does 10 laps, thinking about the same question from every angle. He rarely leaves after the move. Visitors must be invited and scheduled in advance. His daily routine becomes rigid. Right from when he wakes until 10:30 in the morning, walk the sand walk, write until noon, rest until 3 in the afternoon, walk again, rest, write letters in the evening. The routine never varies. Control is how he manages the chaos inside his mind. Emma runs the household. They'll eventually have 10 children, though 3 will die young. She protects Charles from intrusions, makes excuses when people want to visit, buffers him against the world. She's his manager, his nurse, his gatekeeper. But she still doesn't know what he's really working on. Or maybe she does, and they both pretend she doesn't, maintaining this fiction that he's just doing normal natural history and not building a theory that will destroy everything she believes. Darwin wrote a 230-page essay in 1844 explaining his entire theory. Variation, natural selection, descent with modification, common ancestry. It's clear, detailed, and convincing. He shows it to exactly one person, Joseph Hooker, a botanist who becomes his confidant. Everyone else, Henslow, Lyell, even Emma, doesn't see it. He writes a letter to Emma and seals it. Instructions. If I die, publish this essay. Here's £400 to pay for publication and editing. He's planning for his death because he expects persecution if he publishes while alive. He's literally willing to die before making his theory public. The essay sits in a drawer for 14 years. Then in February of 1858, Darwin received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist collecting specimens in Malaysia. Enclosed is a short essay. Title: On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Darwin reads it and feels his stomach drop. Wallace has independently discovered natural selection. Same mechanism, same logic. Different evidence, same conclusion. Wallace is 35 years old, unknown, working alone in jungles, sending specimens back to England to sell so he can keep funding his travels. He's asking Darwin to forward his essay to Charles Lyell for publication. He has no idea Darwin has been sitting on the same theory for 20 years. Darwin writes to Lyell immediately. I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. All my originality will be smashed. The crisis is complete. Publish now and look like he's stealing from Wallace. Let Wallace publish first and lose priority for 20 years of work. Fear of persecution, versus fear of being forgotten. On July 1st, 1858, both Darwin's and Wallace's papers are read at the Linnean Society of London. Neither man attends. Darwin's infant son, Charles Waring, has just died of scarlet fever. He's home grieving. Wallace is in Malaysia, unaware his paper is being presented. The papers get polite applause. No debate, no controversy. The president of the Linnean Society will later write that the year has not been marked by any striking discoveries. The greatest idea in biology is announced to a room that doesn't understand what it's hearing. Chapter 7. The origin. Darwin realizes after that July meeting that if he wants priority, if he wants credit for the theory he's been sitting on for 2 decades, he needs a book, not a short paper. A full case with all his evidence laid out systematically. Wallace's paper was 20 pages. Darwin has 20 years of notes, thousands of specimens, breeding experiments, geological observations, biogeographical data. He needs to write fast. He commits to writing what he calls an abstract of his full theory. Target length, 500 pages. Target time, 1 year. He's 50 years old, chronically ill, has never written anything this ambitious. But he has no choice. He began in September of 1858. The writing process destroys him physically. He works in his study at Down House every morning, from when he wakes until noon. Every afternoon, from 7:30 until 9 at night. That's 3.5 hours maximum per day, because any more, and his body rebels, vomiting, trembling, heart palpitations, weakness so profound he can't stand. He writes longhand. Emma copies his manuscripts because his handwriting is illegible. All cramped letters and crossed out words and notes squeezed into margins. He revises obsessively, crossing out entire paragraphs, rewriting the same sentence 5 different ways, inserting new evidence as he thinks of it. The manuscript becomes chaos, paper layered on paper, corrections on top of corrections. His son Francis will later describe his father's writing desk as a table covered with manuscripts and scraps of paper and specimens, everything mixed together in what looked like disorder but was actually a system only Darwin understood. The physical toll is documented in his diary. In the 12 months between September 1858 and September 1859, he recorded 157 days of illness. That's 43% of the year incapacitated, too ill to work, barely able to leave his room, and he still finishes the book. The structure is strategic, carefully designed to lead readers from safe ground to dangerous conclusions. Chapter 1. Variation under domestication. Pigeons, dogs, crops. Everyone knows breeders can modify species through selective breeding. This is uncontroversial, familiar. He's starting where his audience is comfortable. Chapter 3. Struggle for existence. Here comes Malthus. Population pressure. Competition for limited resources. More individuals born than can survive. Still no explicit evolution, but he's building the foundation. Chapter 4. Natural selection. This is the engine, the mechanism that drives everything. But notice what he doesn't say. The word evolution appears nowhere in the first edition. He uses descent with modification instead. Softer language, less inflammatory. Chapters 6 through 8 address objections before critics can make them. Eyes are too complex to evolve gradually. Here's how they develop step by step, with examples from living species showing every intermediate stage. Sterile insects seem impossible. How can natural selection favour traits that make reproduction impossible? Here's how kin selection works, how helping relatives survive can spread your genes even if you don't reproduce. He's preemptively defending against every argument he knows is coming. Chapter 14, the conclusion, buries the human question in a single sentence. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That's it. No explicit claim that humans evolved from apes. Not yet. Too dangerous. He'll save that for another book, another decade. The most important line comes at the end of chapter 14. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. This is poetry. Darwin is saying his theory is more beautiful than Genesis, that evolution is the real creation story. But notice the phrase, breathed into. He's leaving just enough room for God, barely acknowledging the possibility of divine initial creation. He's trying not to alienate everyone at once. John Murray published 1,250 copies on November 24th, 1859. They sell out the first day. Not because the public understands natural selection, most don't, but because controversy has been building. Word has leaked that this is the book that removes God from biology. Darwin isn't even in London for publication. He's at a hydropathic clinic in Yorkshire, trying to recover from the stress of finishing the manuscript. He writes to Joseph Hooker, "I am weary of my work. It is a dreary, long memoir." He has no idea he just changed human thought forever. The reviews come in immediately. Thomas Huxley, a brilliant biologist with a talent for public combat, writes, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." He becomes Darwin's defender, his bulldog, fighting battles Darwin is too ill and anxious to fight himself. Asa Gray, an American botanist, writes favourable reviews and tries to reconcile evolution with Christianity, arguing that God could work through natural selection. But the negative reviews are vicious. Adam Sedgwick, Darwin's old geology professor at Cambridge, calls it false and grievously mischievous, says Darwin has deserted the true method of induction. Richard Owen, an anatomist Darwin thought was a friend, writes anonymous hostile reviews. Darwin discovers the betrayal later. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce reviews it for the Quarterly Review, calls it speculation without evidence. At a famous debate with Huxley in 1860, Wilberforce asks if Huxley is descended from apes on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side. Huxley replies that he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a man who uses eloquence and wit to obscure truth. The religious press is predictably furious. Darwin is called atheist, materialist, bestial. Political cartoons show him with an ape's body. Robert Fitzroy, Darwin's old captain from the Beagle, reads Origin with horror. He attends the 1860 British Association meeting where evolution is being debated, stands up in the middle of the session, holds up a Bible and shouts that Darwin is wrong, that God's word is true, that he regrets ever giving Darwin passage on the Beagle. The audience ignores him. Fitzroy is dismissed as a religious fanatic, his contribution to the voyage forgotten in favour of Darwin's discoveries. In 1865, Fitzroy would slit his own throat with a razor. The depression that was visible back on the Beagle finally kills him. Whether Darwin's theory contributed to Fitzroy's suicide is unknowable, but Darwin felt guilt about it for the rest of his life. The pattern completes. Darwin surpassed his mentor and destroyed what Fitzroy believed. The student didn't just outgrow the teacher, he killed him. Intellectually first, then maybe literally. Origin goes through 6 editions in Darwin's lifetime. Each edition he revises responds to criticisms, adds evidence, hedges his language. By the 6th edition in 1872, he's added so many defensive passages that the book was weaker, less bold. The first edition had confidence, later editions have caution, but the idea escapes containment anyway. By 1870, most scientists accepted evolution as fact. They argue about mechanism. Is natural selection enough? Or do you need use and disuse like Lamarck suggested? But they accept that species change over time, that life shares common ancestors. Darwin wins the scientific argument within a decade, but the cost is visible on his body. His health deteriorates further. The vomiting becomes constant. He can barely work 2 hours a day. He's 50 years old and looks 70. Chapter 8. The Descent. Darwin doesn't address human evolution in Origin. One sentence hinting at it. That's all. He's leaving that bomb for someone else to drop, hoping maybe the issue will resolve itself somehow. Maybe people will accept evolution for animals and just not think too hard about humans. But everyone is thinking about humans. The question is unavoidable. If all species share common ancestors, what about us? Thomas Huxley published evidence as to man's place in nature in 1863, 4 years after Origin. He argues directly that humans and apes share a common ancestor, that our skeletons are nearly identical, that the anatomical differences between us and chimpanzees are smaller than the differences between chimpanzees and gorillas. The book causes outrage, but Huxley has advantages Darwin doesn't. He's not chronically ill, he's not anxious, and he loves public combat, thrives on controversy. Darwin watches from Downhouse, takes notes, waits for the smoke to clear. He's not ready yet. By 1868, Darwin was 59 years old, and he published Orchids and Domestication, but he avoided the human question for 12 years. Why finally write about it now? Partly scientific duty. If he doesn't do it right, someone else will do it wrong. Ernst Haeckel in Germany is already writing about human evolution, but he's adding racist nonsense that Darwin finds repellent, ranking races on evolutionary hierarchies that have no scientific basis, partly completeness. Origin is incomplete without humans. Everyone knows it. He knows it. Part-time. He's 59 and chronically ill. If he doesn't write it now, he'll die without finishing what he started. He began The Descent of Man in 1869. The book is actually 2 books crammed together. Part 1 argues that humans are animals. Our skeletons resemble ape skeletons. We have vestigial features, tailbones from when our ancestors had tails, wisdom teeth from when our ancestors needed bigger jaws, body hair that serves no function now. Our embryos look like other mammal embryos in early development. We share parasites with apes, specific lice species that only live on primates. Darwin goes further than anatomy. He argues consciousness evolved, morality evolved, religion evolved. Everything we think makes us special is just elaborated animal behaviour. Dogs show loyalty and affection. Elephants mourn their dead. Chimpanzees cooperate and punish cheaters. Human morality is more complex, but it's the same thing. Behaviours that evolved because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. This is the real heresy. Not that we descended from apes. By 1871, many scientists suspected that, but that our minds, our souls, our sense of right and wrong, all of it came from natural processes. No divine spark needed. Part 2 introduces sexual selection, a mechanism Darwin thinks works alongside natural selection. Natural selection explains survival, camouflage, speed, strength, but it doesn't explain beauty. Peacock tails are useless for survival, actually detrimental. They're heavy, bright, and make males easier for predators to spot. So why do they exist? Because females prefer males with big tails. Over generations, tails get bigger because the males with the biggest tails get to mate. Sexual selection explains things natural selection can't. Bright colours, elaborate songs, complicated dances. Darwin argues human hairlessness, music, art, even morality evolved partly through sexual selection. These traits made our ancestors attractive to potential mates, so they spread through populations. Critics hate this. It seems too trivial, too focused on mating preferences to explain major evolutionary changes. But Darwin is committed to the idea the most dangerous chapter is Chapter 7, on the races of man. Here Darwin walks a tightrope he doesn't quite manage to stay on. On one hand, he argues all human races are one species. We can interbreed, we share common ancestors. There's no biological basis for racial hierarchy. The differences between races are superficial, mostly skin colour and facial features shaped by climate. On the other hand, he ranks races by civilization. Europeans at the top, indigenous peoples at the bottom. He suggests savage races will go extinct when contacted by civilized races because natural selection favours the civilized. This is Victorian racism, dressed in scientific language. Darwin wasn't immune to his time. He hated slavery, thought it was morally abhorrent, but he absorbed the imperial assumption that European culture was superior, more advanced, further along some imaginary ladder of progress. The contradiction cuts deep. Darwin destroyed the biblical justification for racism. If all humans share common ancestors, there's no separate creation of races. But he accidentally provided an evolutionary justification. Some races are more evolved than others. His followers will take this second part and run straight into eugenics, forced sterilization, all the horrors of racial science. Darwin didn't intend this, but he enabled it. The book was published on February 24th, 1871. First printing is 2,500 copies, sells out in one day. Murray immediately prints 5,000 more. Why the massive demand? Everyone knew this book was coming. Dissent is what Origin hinted at for 12 years. The secret was made explicit. The religious press is predictably furious. Darwin is called bestial, degrading, atheistic. One reviewer says he's trying to brutalize humanity, to strip away everything noble about human nature, and reduce us to mere animals. The scientific reception is complicated. Alfred Russel Wallace, Darwin's co-discoverer of natural selection, loves the animal evidence, but can't accept that human minds evolved naturally. Wallace believes God intervened at some point to give humans souls, consciousness, moral sense. This breaks Darwin's heart. His ally, the man who shares credit for natural selection, can't accept the full theory when it comes to humans. Thomas Huxley fully supports it, though he thinks Darwin is too cautious about race, too willing to rank civilizations. Asa Gray tries to reconcile dissent with Christianity, arguing God could use evolution as his tool. Darwin appreciates the effort, but privately thinks it's incoherent. Emma Darwin reads Dissent and doesn't argue, doesn't debate. She just withdraws emotionally. She's always known Charles doubted God, but reading it in print is different. He's not just doubting, he's systematically dismantling the idea that humans have divine souls, that there's anything special about us that separates us from animals. For Emma, this means she and Charles won't be reunited in heaven. When he dies, he's gone forever. This is her private agony, the loss she's mourning while he's still alive. Darwin knows, he sees her pain, but he publishes anyway. His intellectual honesty costs him intimate connection. He can't hide his thoughts anymore, can't maintain the polite fiction. The price is his wife's faith in their eternal future together. The backlash peaks after dissent. Political cartoons show Darwin as an ape. Schools ban evolution. Religious leaders call it satanic. But the intensity of the backlash proves Darwin has won. You don't rage against an idea unless it's already winning, unless it's already taking over the intellectual landscape, and you're desperately trying to hold it back. By 1871, most scientists accepted evolution. They're arguing about details, mechanism, timescale, whether humans are an exception, but not about the fact of common descent. The religious world loses. Not immediately, not completely, but irreversibly. Chapter 9. The Worms. After publishing Descent of Man. In 1871, Darwin is 62 years old and infamous. His name appears in newspapers, his face in political cartoons. His reputation is the man who said we're descended from apes, who removed God from biology, who stripped away human dignity. He could write more controversial books, could engage his critics, could spend his remaining years fighting the culture war. Instead, he studies earthworms. Surface explanation. They're interesting. Worms drag leaves underground, mix soil layers, affect drainage and plant growth. Darwin puts a plate of glass over worms in his garden and watches them decide which leaves to pull down first. They prefer certain shapes over others. He plays piano for them to see if they respond to sound. They ignore it, deaf. He shines bright lights on them. They retreat into their burrows immediately, sensitive to light despite having no eyes. Real explanation. Worms are safe. Nobody cares about worms. Nobody will write angry letters about worm theology. Darwin is exhausted from decades of controversy. Worms let him be a naturalist again, not a revolutionary. This is a strategic retreat. He's done the dangerous work, origin, descent, the complete dismantling of biblical creation. Now he's allowed to study something harmless, something that won't get him called atheist in the morning papers. He published The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms in October of 1881. The title is terrible and sounds like the most boring book ever written, but the findings are fascinating. He calculates that worms process 10 tons of soil per acre per year. Ancient Roman ruins in England have sunk into the ground, not because the ground rose, but because worms buried them grain by grain over centuries. The entire English countryside is shaped by worms working invisibly beneath the surface. The book sells better than Origin, 3,500 copies in the first year. Why? Partly because people are curious about Darwin now. We'll read anything he writes. He's become a celebrity scientist, his name alone guaranteeing sales, but also because the book is safe. Victorian readers can enjoy Darwin's worm observations without confronting ape ancestry. It's Darwin the gentle naturalist, the patient observer, not Darwin the god killer. He's been studying worms for 40 years, on and off. His first paper on earthworms was published in 1837, right after the Beagle voyage. His last book in 1881 returns to them. That's his entire scientific career, bookended by invertebrates. He builds special enclosures in his garden, measures worm castings, their waste, to calculate how much soil they move, does experiments over decades to see how quickly objects sink into worm-worked soil, gets his children to help collect data, continue observations while he's too ill to work. This is vintage Darwin, obsessive measurement of something everyone else ignores. It's how he approached barnacles, orchids, climbing plants, and coral reefs. Find something small, understand it completely, discover it's more important than anyone realised. By 1881, Darwin's children were adults, and several had become scientists. George is an astronomer and mathematician. Francis is a botanist who works with his father. Leonard will become a military engineer, and later, unfortunately, a eugenicist. Horace is an engineer. They've grown up in a house where data collection is normal, where evidence matters more than authority. Emma managed the household through everything. 10 children born, 7 survived to adulthood. Anne died at age 10 in 1851, probably from tuberculosis, and Darwin was devastated. This death probably finalised his loss of faith. Mary Eleanor died at 3 weeks old. Charles Waring died at 18 months from scarlet fever and had Down syndrome. The death shaped Darwin's view of nature. If God designed everything, why do children suffer and die? Natural selection explains it. Most offspring die, no design, just probability and circumstance. It's bleak, but it's honest. By 1880, Darwin had become respectable. The controversy has faded into history. New battles are being fought among scientists. Darwinism versus Lamarckism, natural selection versus orthogenesis. But everyone accepts evolution happened. The question is just about mechanisms and timescales. Honours arrive. Cambridge gave him an honorary degree in 1878, the same university that trained him to be a person 50 years earlier. The Royal Society awards him the Royal Medal. German scientists start calling him the Great Darwin, this elder statesman of science. He's invited to state dinners, scientific ceremonies, and public events, usually declines, too ill, too anxious to travel. But the invitations prove he's won. The man called a bestial atheist in 1860 is now a national treasure. The pattern completes. Revolutionary becomes heretic, becomes respected elder. He lived long enough to see his ideas normalised, to watch evolution go from dangerous speculation to established fact. Even at 72, Darwin is experimenting. His son Francis writes that his father was never idle. Even on his worst days, when he could only lie on the sofa, he was thinking. His last projects were all about mechanisms, how plants move toward light, how climbing plants wrap tendrils around supports, how Venus flytraps digest insects, how worms work soil. He's still asking how things work, still obsessed with understanding processes everyone else takes for granted. Natural selection explains why species change, but Darwin wants to know how organisms function day to day. The curiosity that made him dissect birds as a child never left, just got more sophisticated, more focused. Chapter 10. The Death. Darwin is bedridden by April of 1882, heart failing after years of chronic illness. He's 73, can't walk without help, can barely breathe. Emma sits beside him. Several of their children are there. Around 4 in the afternoon, on April 19th, he tells Emma, "I am not the least afraid to die." Then he loses consciousness. Emma holds one hand, Francis holds the other. At 4 o'clock, Charles Darwin stops breathing. The official cause is syncope, heart failure. Unofficially, it's 40 years of chronic illness finally catching up. Possibly Chagas disease from a bug bite in Argentina in 1835. Possibly psychosomatic stress. Possibly Crohn's disease. His body had been failing since the Beagle voyage. It finally gave up. His last words should have been about worms or barnacles, something small and safe. Instead, he faced death without fear. A man who spent his life destroying the afterlife dies unafraid. The ultimate data point. Darwin's will specifies burial in the churchyard at Down Village, Next, his brother Erasmus, who died the year before. Simple grave. No fuss. He doesn't want Westminster Abbey. Too grand, too public, not his style. But within hours of his death, letters arrive at Down House. Thomas Huxley, Joseph Hooker, other prominent scientists petition. Darwin must be buried in Westminster Abbey. He's earned it. He's England's greatest scientist since Newton. Emma hesitates. Charles wanted simplicity, but the scientists argue that his burial location is symbolic. If he's buried in a village churchyard, history might forget him. If he's in Westminster Abbey, alongside Newton and King's, his ideas become permanent. Parliament agrees to a state funeral. Emma accepts. The funeral was held on April 26, 1882. Westminster Abbey is packed. Thousands attend. The pallbearers include Huxley, Hooker, Alfred Russel Wallace, his co-discoverer, the Duke of Devonshire, the American ambassador. 3 archbishops officiate, Christian service, hymns, prayers, no mention of evolution. No mention that Darwin didn't believe any of this. The cognitive dissonance is extraordinary. The Church of England is burying the man who made the Church's creation story obsolete. But denying him Westminster Abbey would look petty, so they claim him instead. Better to absorb the revolutionary than reject him. Darwin would have found this hilarious or depressing. He's buried in the nave near Isaac Newton's grave. The placement is deliberate. Newton explained the physical universe. Darwin explained the living universe. 2 pillars of English science. His gravestone is simple. Charles Robert Darwin, born February 12, 1809, died April 19, 1882. No mention of evolution, no mention of origin of species, just name and dates. The most revolutionary scientist since Newton gets a minimalist gravestone because nobody could agree on what else to write. The fights over his legacy begin immediately. Churches have to decide, was Darwin right? Most clergy continue rejecting evolution. Some try reconciliation. God used evolution as his tool. A few embrace it fully and abandon literal Genesis. But the cultural damage is done. By 1900, educated Victorians assume evolution is true. The Bible becomes metaphor, not literal history. Darwin didn't destroy religion, but he destroyed its monopoly on explaining life. Scientists accept evolution as fact but argue about mechanism. Some think natural selection is too slow. Propose orthogenesis, built-in drives toward complexity. Some prefer Lamarckism, inheritance of acquired traits. Some add saltation, evolution by sudden jumps. It takes until the 1930s and 1940s for the modern synthesis, genetics plus natural selection, to prove Darwin's mechanism correct. He's right, but he dies decades before he's fully vindicated. The eugenics nightmare begins almost immediately. Darwin's cousin Francis Galton founds the eugenics movement in 1883, the year after Darwin died. Apply natural selection to humans. Breed better humans. Sterilize the unfit. Darwin never advocated this. In Dissent, he wrote, "We could not check our sympathy without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature." He thought helping the weak was what made us human. But his followers ignore this. They take survival of the fittest, a phrase from Herbert Spencer, not Darwin, and apply it to social policy. Forced sterilizations, immigration restrictions based on race, and eventually the Nazis. Darwin's son Leonard becomes a prominent eugenicist. His theories are twisted into justification for atrocity. This is his darkest legacy, not what he believed, but what others did with his ideas. Emma outlives Charles by 14 years and dies in 1896. Never remarries. Keeps Downhouse exactly as he left it. His study preserved like a shrine. She's protecting his memory, but also living in the past with a man who's gone. She never publicly discusses whether she reconciled his materialism with her Christianity. Private letters suggest she didn't. She loved him. She feared for his soul. Both remained true until her death. The final irony, she's buried beside him, together forever in the ground as matter, not in heaven as souls. Darwin's version of eternity, not hers. Chapter 11. The Distortion. Darwin died in 1882, and within a year his theories are being used to justify things he explicitly opposed. This is the ugliest part of his legacy, what happened when survival of the fittest became politics. Herbert Spencer coined survival of the fittest in 1864, and Darwin adopted the phrase in later editions of Origin, which is a mistake. Spencer means something Darwin doesn't. Spencer applies it to economics. The rich are rich because they're biologically superior. The poor are poor because they're inferior. Government aid interferes with natural selection, props up the unfit, weakens the species. This is not Darwin's argument. Darwin meant fittest, as best fitted to the current environment. A tapeworm is fit for its environment. Fitness is context-dependent, not absolute. There's no hierarchy, no ladder of progress. But Spencer's version spreads like disease. Industrialists love it. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller cite social Darwinism to justify their monopolies. We're not cruel, we're just more evolved. It's self-serving pseudoscience. Darwin would have hated this. In Descent, he wrote explicitly that helping the helpless is what makes us human, that sympathy is our noblest quality. Spencer says helping the weak weakens the species. Opposite conclusions from the same theory. In 1883, Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, published Inquiries into Human Faculty and founded eugenics. Breed humans like we breed dogs. Encourage superior people to have children. Discourage inferior people from reproducing. Galton thinks he's applying Darwin's principles. He's not. Natural selection is unconscious. Nobody decides who reproduces. Eugenics is conscious selection by flawed humans deciding who deserves to exist. But the idea spreads. By 1900, eugenics was mainstream. 32 American states passed forced sterilization laws between 1907 and 1937. Over 60,000 Americans are sterilized against their will. Targets include the mentally ill, disabled, poor, epileptic, and promiscuous women. Britain founded the Eugenics Education Society in 1907. Germany developed racial hygiene movements in the 1890s that eventually became Nazi eugenics. Darwin's son Leonard becomes president of the Eugenics Education Society. I believe in it completely. The irony is almost unbearable. Darwin's own child uses his father's science to justify eliminating people his father would have defended. Descent of Man's Race chapter gets weaponized. Darwin wrote that all humans are one species, but he also ranked civilized versus savage races. Imperialists take the ranking, ignore the unity. Result: scientific racism. Claims that natural selection produced racial hierarchy. Europeans at top, everyone else inferior. Used to justify colonialism. We're helping inferior races evolve. Used to justify slavery. They're closer to apes. Used to justify genocide. Inferior races are doomed to extinction anyway. This isn't Darwin's intent. But intent doesn't matter when your ideas escape containment. The 1924 Immigration Act in the United States cites evolution to justify excluding inferior nationalities, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Asians, Africans. The logic, protecting the gene pool. The Nazis took eugenics to its logical endpoint between 1933 and 1945. 400,000 Germans forcibly sterilized. 200,000 disabled people murdered in the T4 euthanasia program. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, along with 5 million others. The Nazis cite evolution. Hitler in Mein Kampf. Nature's law of selection. Only the healthy shall beget children. Goebbels calls it applied biology. But this isn't Darwinism. It's a total misunderstanding. Natural selection has no goal, doesn't prefer higher over lower, just describes what happens when organisms reproduce in environments with limited resources. The Nazis added teleology, progress toward perfection. Darwin explicitly rejected this. They added group selection, races competing as units. Darwin focused on individuals. They added designed selection, humans deciding who lives. Darwin described an unplanned process. Its evolution vocabulary is filled with fascist ideology. Not Darwin's fault, but his name is attached forever. The Scopes trial in July of 1925 turns evolution into culture war. John Scopes is tried for teaching evolution in Tennessee, which is illegal under state law. The trial became a national spectacle. William Jennings. Bryan prosecutes evolution destroys morality. Clarence Darrow defends evolution is science, teach children truth. Scopes is found guilty, fined $100. But the trial exposes the American divide. Urban versus rural, science versus religion, modernity versus tradition. Evolution stops being science, it becomes politics. This lasts a century. American schools still fight over teaching evolution in 2025. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union between the 1930s and 1960s, Stalin's regime rejected Darwinism. Why? Because natural selection is bourgeois science. Competition, inequality, randomness. Communism needs cooperative, directed evolution. Trofim Lysenko proposes Lamarckian evolution. Organisms inherit acquired traits. Wheat exposed to cold produces cold-resistant offspring. This is wrong, but Stalin supports it because it fits communist ideology. Result: Soviet genetics is destroyed. Scientists who defend Darwinism are imprisoned or executed. Agriculture fails because Lysenko's methods don't work. Millions starve. Darwinism was banned in the USSR until 1964. The irony: Darwin's theory was too egalitarian for capitalists and too competitive for communists. Both sides distorted it to fit their ideology. A few scientists fight back. Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright show natural selection works mathematically. Theodosius Dobzhansky published Genetics and the Origin of Species in 1937, proving natural selection plus Mendelian genetics equals complete theory. By 1950, Darwinism was back on solid ground. Scientists understand evolution by natural selection is blind, undirected, amoral. It doesn't justify capitalism, fascism, or communism. It just explains biodiversity. But the public damage is done. To millions of people, Darwinism means social inequality is natural, eugenics is scientific, morality doesn't exist. Nazis were following Darwin. None of this is true. But truth is less memorable than atrocity. Chapter 12. The Rediscovery. The Origin of Species has one massive hole that Darwin can't fill. He knows parents pass traits to offspring. He knows variation exists. He knows natural selection acts on variation. But he doesn't know how inheritance actually works. His best guess is blending inheritance. Offspring are mixtures of parents. But this creates an impossible problem. If traits blend, variation should disappear within a few generations. Like mixing paint colours, eventually everything is grey. Darwin knows this is wrong, but he doesn't know why. In 1866, Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, published Experiments on Plant Hybridization. He bred pear plants for 8 years, tracking traits like seed colour and plant height. His discoveries: traits are inherited as discrete units. They don't blend, they're either dominant or recessive. Offspring get 1 unit from each parent. This solves Darwin's problem. If traits are discrete particles, variation doesn't disappear. New combinations keep appearing. Blending doesn't happen. But nobody reads Mendel's paper, published in an obscure journal. Darwin never hears about it. Mendel died in 1884, believing his work was ignored. He was right. It takes 16 years for anyone to notice. In 1900, 3 botanists independently rediscovered Mendel's laws. Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Correns in Germany, Erich von Tschermak in Austria. All 3 were working on inheritance. All 3 found the same patterns. All 3 discovered Mendel's paper and realised he'd beaten them by 35 years. Suddenly genetics exists. The field was born in 1900, but early geneticists think Mendel contradicts Darwin. Mendelian traits are discrete, either tall or short, yellow or green, no in between. Darwinian traits are continuous. Height, weight, beak size vary smoothly. The geneticists conclude evolution happens by sudden jumps through mutation, not gradual change. Natural selection is irrelevant. Biologists split into camps, Mendelians versus Darwinians. They argue bitterly for 20 years. Darwin's theory looks obsolete. Then mathematicians solve it. Ronald Fisher proved in 1918 that continuous variation comes from many genes acting together. Each gene follows Mendelian rules, but collectively they create smooth gradients. This reconciles discrete genes with continuous traits. J. B. S. Haldane calculates between 1924 and 1932 how fast selection can change gene frequencies. Shows natural selection is powerful enough to drive evolution even with low mutation rates. Sewell Wright introduces genetic drift in 1931, random changes in gene frequencies in small populations. Not everything is selection. Some evolution is a chance. Theodosius Dobzhansky published Genetics and the Origin of Species in 1937, bringing everything together. Mendelian genetics plus natural selection plus mutation plus drift equals complete evolutionary theory. This is the modern synthesis. Darwin's mechanism plus Mendel's mechanism equals unified theory. Evolution is now mathematically proven, not just plausible. Then on April 25th, 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick published the structure of DNA double helix. Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography provided the key evidence, though she wasn't credited until much later. DNA is the physical mechanism of inheritance. Genes aren't abstract units, they're sequences of nucleotides. Mutations are copying errors. Heredity is chemistry. Darwin's theory now has molecular proof. Traits are encoded. Parents pass DNA to offspring. Selection acts on DNA variation. It's all material, no vital force, no divine spark, just chemistry obeying natural laws. Darwin died 71 years before Watson and Crick. He never saw his theory completed. Once DNA is understood, evidence for evolution explodes. The universal genetic code, all life uses the same DNA alphabet, A, T, G, C, and same codons. Why? Because all life descended from a common ancestor. If species were separately created, they'd use different codes. Molecular clocks. DNA mutates at roughly constant rates. Compare DNA sequences between species, measure differences, calculate time since common ancestor. Result: humans and chimps diverged about 6 million years ago. Matches fossil records perfectly. Pseudogenes. Humans have a gene for synthesizing vitamin C, but it's broken. We need dietary vitamin C because the gene doesn't work. Other primates have the same broken gene. Why? Because we inherited it from a common ancestor where the gene broke once. Then we all inherited the broken version. If God designed us, why include broken genes? Endogenous retroviruses. Viruses sometimes insert their DNA into host genomes. These insertions are inherited. Humans and chimps have the same viral DNA in the same chromosomal locations. Only explanation: the virus infected our common ancestor before we diverged. Then we inherited the insertion. This is proof, not inference, direct molecular evidence of common ancestry. Evolutionary developmental biology discovered in the 1990s that the same genes control body plans in all animals. Hox genes determine head versus tail in flies, fish, mice, humans. Change one Hox gene and flies grow legs where antennas should be. Implication: all animals are variations on a single body plan. We're not separately designed. We're modified versions of an ancient ancestor. Darwin couldn't see genes. Modern scientists see genes controlling development in fruit flies and the same genes controlling development in humans. The unity of life is visible in DNA. Darwin died before his theory was proven. He had the right idea with incomplete evidence. Mendel had the missing piece, but didn't know it fit Darwin's framework. It took 80 years to connect them. This is how science works: slow, collective, incremental. No one person sees the whole picture. Darwin saw inheritance and selection, but not genes. Mendel saw genes, but not evolution. Watson and Crick saw DNA, but built on Franklin's work. The modern synthesis took 30 years and dozens of scientists. The final theory has Darwin's name on it, but it's really the work of a century. Darwin would have appreciated that. He didn't want followers. He wanted people to keep investigating. They did. Chapter 13. The Resistance. Here's a paradox that should be impossible. In 2024, 97% of scientists accept evolution, but only 40% of Americans do. Evolution is as proven as gravity, germ theory, heliocentrism. Yet half the US population rejects it. Why? The Scopes trial in 1925 made evolution a culture war issue instead of a science issue. It stopped being "is this true?" and became "what kind of person are you?" Accept evolution and you're signalling, I trust scientists, I'm educated, I'm modern. Reject evolution and you're signalling, I trust the Bible, I value tradition, I resist secular authority. Science becomes secondary. It's tribal identity. After Scopes, creationists evolved. Ironic word choice. They stopped arguing, Earth is 6,000 years old, and started arguing, maybe Earth is old, but God guided evolution. Young Earth creationism became Old Earth creationism, theistic evolution. In the 1960s and 70s, scientific creationism emerged. Claims flood geology explains fossils, thermodynamics disproves evolution, irreducible complexity means some organs are too complex to evolve gradually. These arguments are scientific sounding, but scientifically false, designed for lay audiences who don't know enough biology to spot the errors. In the 1990s, creationists rebranded as intelligent design. New arguments. Life is too complex to arise by chance. Cells have irreducible complexity. Specified complexity requires a designer. ID avoids mentioning God explicitly, calls the designer intelligence, but everyone knows it's God. It's creationism, with the serial numbers filed off. In 2005, the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial happened. Pennsylvania school board mandates teaching ID parents sue. Federal judge rules ID is creationism disguised as science, therefore unconstitutional in public schools. ID loses legally, but it wins culturally. Many Americans still believe it. Why do people reject evolution? Rarely for scientific reasons. Existential threat. If humans are accidents of natural processes, life has no inherent meaning. This is terrifying. Easier to reject evolution than accept meaninglessness. Moral foundations. Many believe morality requires God. If we're just animals, why be good? Darwin answered this in Descent. Morality evolved, but most people haven't read Darwin. Identity protection. For religious communities, accepting evolution means rejecting literal Bible interpretation. That's not just losing a belief, it's losing community, family approval, identity itself, distrust of authority. Scientists as a class are distrusted by many Americans. Experts say evolution is true isn't persuasive, it's suspicious. Death anxiety. Evolution means we're mortal, no afterlife guaranteed. This is psychologically intolerable for many people. These are emotional, not logical. You can't argue someone out of existential terror with evidence. Current polling shows 40% of Americans believe God created humans in the present form 10,000 years ago. 33% believe humans evolved, but God guided the process. Only 22% accept naturalistic evolution, Darwin's actual theory. So 73% of Americans accept some form of creationism. Only 22% accept unguided natural selection. By education level, 52% of people with postgraduate degrees accept naturalistic evolution. Only 13% of people with high school or less do. By religion, 3% of weekly church attenders accept naturalistic evolution. 51% of people who never attend church do. The pattern, education and secularization correlate with acceptance, but even educated Americans often accept theistic evolution, a compromise position. Globally, evolution acceptance varies wildly. Iceland, 85%. Denmark, 82%. France, 80%. United States, 40%. Turkey, 25%. Saudi Arabia, evolution not taught. Interestingly, the Catholic Church officially accepts evolution. Pope John Paul II said in 1996 that evolution is more than a hypothesis, but many American evangelicals don't follow the Pope's lead. The lesson? It's not Christianity versus evolution, it's certain interpretations of Christianity versus evolution. American schools fail to fix this. Many biology teachers skip evolution or teach it weakly to avoid parent complaints. Publishers water down textbooks to avoid offending religious markets. Students are resistant, telling a 15-year-old from a creationist family, "Your parents are wrong," doesn't go well. A result, many American students graduate without understanding evolution. They know it's controversial. They don't know why it's true. This isn't really about fossils or DNA. It's about meaning, morality, human specialness, authority. Who decides truth, science or scripture? Darwin's theory forces answers many find unbearable. Life has no inherent purpose. Morality is evolved, not objective. We're not special. Science decides empirical truth, not religion. These answers work for scientists. They're devastating for people who built their lives on opposite premises. Darwin's theory won scientifically 100 years ago, but it's still losing culturally. Why? Because science answers how, but not why. Evolution explains how humans arose. It doesn't explain why we're here, what we should do, whether life matters. Those are philosophical questions. Darwin wasn't a philosopher. He described the mechanism. He didn't provide meaning. People need meaning more than they need accuracy. That's why creationism persists. The evidence isn't ambiguous. The implications are unbearable. Chapter 14. The Revolution. Darwin didn't just change biology. He changed 5 fundamental ways we see ourselves, and we're still processing the damage. First revolution, biology. Before Darwin, species were fixed types created by God, unchanging since creation. The great chain of being. God at top, humans below, animals below that, plants at bottom. Everything had its place. After Darwin, species are temporary clusters in a continuum. They change, split, go extinct. There's no hierarchy, just branching. Bacteria aren't lower than humans. They're just adapted to different environments. The ladder becomes a tree. No top, no bottom, just survival. Impact, entire fields emerge. Paleontology, comparative anatomy, biogeography, molecular biology. All assume evolution. Theodosius Dobzhansky said it perfectly. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Second revolution, religion. Before Darwin, William Paley's watchmaker argument dominated. Complexity implies design. Eyes, wings, hearts, too intricate to be accidents. Therefore, God designed them. After Darwin, natural selection creates complexity without a designer. Random variation plus differential survival plus deep time equals eyes, wings, hearts. No watchmaker needed. Religious impact, literal. Genesis becomes untenable. Churches must choose. Reject Darwin, accept Darwin but reinterpret Bible, or accept Darwin and claim God uses evolution as his tool. Most educated Christians choose the third option, but it's unstable. If God uses random mutation and mass extinction, he's either indifferent or incompetent. The problem of evil becomes biological. Result, by 1900, educated Victorians treat the Bible as literature, not science. Secularization accelerates. Darwin didn't kill God, but he removed God from nature. That's a smaller universe. Third revolution, humanity. Before Darwin, humans were God's image. We had souls, animals didn't. We were separate from nature. The gap between humans and apes was infinite, spiritual, not biological. After Darwin, humans are African apes. We share 98.8% DNA with chimpanzees. Our minds evolved. Our morality evolved. Our consciousness is complex animal behaviour, not divine gift. The gap between us and chimps is 6 million years, not infinity. Psychological impact. For many, this is unbearable. If we're animals, why be moral? Darwin answered this. Cooperation evolved, but the existential wound remains. We went from the cosmic centre to the cosmic accident, from God's children to modified apes, from eternal souls to temporary meat. Some find this liberating, free from a divine authority. Most find it devastating. Fourth revolution, time. Before Darwin, Earth was about 6,000 years old, calculated from Bible genealogies. Creation happened October 23rd, 4004 BC, according to Archbishop Usher. After Darwin plus geology, Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life began 3.5 billion years ago. Humans have existed for 300,000 years. Civilization for 10,000 years. We're 0.000067% of Earth's history. A blip. This changes perspective. Human history isn't 6,000 years of divine plan. It's invisible on a geological timescale. We're newcomers, latecomers, and will probably be gone soon, geologically speaking. Why this matters? Deep time makes human concerns seem trivial. Your problems, your achievements, your civilization, invisible on geological timescale. Some find this humbling, others find it nihilistic. Fifth revolution, meaning. Before Darwin, meaning came from God. Your purpose was serving God, following his commandments, earning heaven. Morality was objective, God's law. Life had inherent meaning. After Darwin, meaning is human invention. There's no cosmic purpose. Morality evolved to facilitate cooperation. Life has no inherent meaning, just the meaning you construct. This is the deepest revolution. Darwin removed teleology from nature. The universe doesn't care about you. Nature doesn't have goals. Evolution isn't progressing toward anything. It's just happening. Responses split three ways. Existentialists embrace this. We're free to create meaning. Nihilists despair. If there's no inherent meaning, why do anything? Religious people reject Darwin entirely to preserve meaning. Most people oscillate between these positions. They accept evolution intellectually, but live as if life has purpose. The cognitive dissonance is permanent. Darwin's influence ripples through culture. Philosophy, existentialism, pragmatism, evolutionary psychology all build on Darwin. Nietzsche's God is Dead is partly response to Darwin. If life evolved, God didn't create it. Psychology. Freud's unconscious mind is Darwinian. Animal drives beneath rational veneer. Evolutionary psychology applies natural selection to behavior. Economics. Social Darwinism justifies capitalism as natural. This is wrong scientifically, but influential culturally. Literature. Thomas Hardy's pessimism. Nature is indifferent. Life is cruel. H.G. Wells's science fiction. Humans are fragile. Evolution continues. Art. Darwinism contributes to modernism's fragmentation. If humans aren't special, art doesn't need to be uplifting. It can be brutal, honest. The modern tension, 166 years after origin, most educated people accept evolution intellectually, but we haven't integrated it emotionally. We live as if life has meaning. Humans are special. Morality is objective. We matter cosmically. None of this is objectively true under Darwinism. This gap between what we believe and how we live is permanent. Darwin created it. We can't close it. We can only manage it. Some manage by compartmentalizing. Evolution is true in lab. God is true in church. Some manage by rejecting Darwin. Some manage by embracing nihilism, then creating meaning anyway. None of these are stable. Darwin's revolution is incomplete because we're still in it. 3 scientific revolutions destroyed human centrality. Copernicus. Earth isn't the center of the universe. Darwin. Humans aren't separate from animals. Freud. Consciousness isn't in control. Each removed a layer of specialness. Copernicus gave us a larger universe. Darwin gave us deeper time. Freud gave us hidden selves. Together, they made us small, recent, and not in charge. This is the modern condition, knowledge that undermines meaning. We can't know what Darwin taught, but we can't live as if he's right either. We're trapped between the world we understand and the world we need. That's Darwin's legacy, not just evolution, permanent exile from innocence. So there you have it, Charles Darwin, the man who changed everything by simply watching. From a grieving boy collecting beetles to the scientist who dethroned humanity from its cosmic pedestal. His theory didn't just explain finches and fossils, it forced us to confront what we are, modified apes on a minor planet, meaningful only because we choose to be. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, does Darwin's vision of life, beautiful, brutal, and without inherent purpose, terrify you or liberate you? Thanks for listening.